Hello, class. Welcome to week 6 and lecture 5 on August the 15th, 2022. Hope you're enjoying the class so far. We had our midterm last week, so we are halfway through. We'll have 4 more lectures and then the final exam in 5 weeks. All right, so let's begin the lesson for today. All right, so this is BMN 507, lecture 5, but it's week 6 of the class. And so we will pick up where we left off, continuing chapter 6 of the book. And we'll start with the prophets and their times, the origins of prophecy. So in one sense, prophecy was always present in Israel. For the charismatic aspect of religion has been shown to be as old as religion itself. That's kind of the idea that God empowers people or speaks to people and uses them. The evidence for prophecy as a distinct, recognized phenomenon begins to appear in materials associated with the Philistine oppression that led to the rise of the Israelite state and its monarchy. Samuel is the first individual figure portrayed in the Bible who exhibited the characteristics of what was later deemed prophecy. Now, you could argue there are a few before him, like Moses, Deborah, and the Judges, but Samuel is probably the first person we would call the sort of office of prophet or official prophet. So he had it, and sometimes was accompanied by a band known as the Sons of the Prophets, a prophetic guild of which he was the head or father. That word used symbolically, not literally. So Samuel anointed kings, delivered divine oracles, and conversed with God concerning the destiny of Israel. The historical books contain a variety of traditions bearing on a number of other prophets. Together with the Levites, these prophets are portrayed as strong advocates of Mosaic religion, meaning the Torah, the 10 Commandments, what we see especially in the first 5 books of the Bible. Saul had no developed hierarchy, meaning he had no official royal prophets, but 2 prophets are associated with David's staff. Gad, the seer is another word for prophet, was a part of David's wilderness company and served as the intermediary during the Jerusalem years. The other, Nathan, appeared to be a central figure in the Jerusalem court, who initially approves but later forbids David's project to build a temple for the Lord in Jerusalem. He also confronted David for his sin against Uriah the Hittite and played a key role in opposing Adonijah's attempt to take the throne. And then also he was supporting the succession of Solomon. Prophetic activity was also associated with the disruption of the Israelite kingdom. Ahijah enacted an oracle that suggested the young bureaucrat Jeroboam commit sedition, while Shemaiah persuaded Rehoboam, that's Solomon's son, not to launch a fratricidal war at the time of Jeroboam's revolt. So Rehoboam initially wanted to fight the northern kingdom that rebelled against him, and he still led the southern kingdom, but this prophet convinced him not to try to fight the northern kingdom because they're brothers of the tribes of Israel are all brothers, the northern and southern half of the kingdom. So we'll turn now to Elijah and Elisha. The Arabian wars of the 9th century were the occasion for another upsurge of prophetic activity. The prophets played an undecided role in these events, as they both appear as Israelite patriots who helped Ahab and his sons against their enemies, while they also condemned the entire house of Ahab for policies instigated by Ahab's queen Jezebel, who was the princess of Sidon. The 2 principal prophets associated with this period are Elijah and his follower and successor, Elisha. Similar names, but note the slight difference. Micaiah is also the central figure in a fairly long narrative in 1 Kings 22, which provides significant information about the prophetic phenomenon. Elijah is portrayed as a person of remarkable strength and energy, whose primitive clothing may symbolize a rejection of settled agrarian life and urban life. Elijah appears as the adversary of King Ahab, but his real target is the patronage by Queen Jezebel of the cult of the pagan prophet Baal. That was the god of Jezebel's people, and she introduced that worship into Israel, which was obviously blasphemy, or that obviously caused the people to turn away from their true God, Yahweh. So the cycle of Elijah's stories ends with his being taken to heaven by a whirlwind, while horses and chariots of fire separate him and his successor, Elisha. Later, Jewish lore foretells his return as the herald of the day of the Lord. Elijah and Elisha were portrayed as wonder workers. Both performed feeding miracles and resuscitated dead children, meaning they brought dead children back to life. Elisha headed a band of prophets, and Elijah may have preceded him in this position. The final recorded act of Elisha marks a turning point in Israelite prophecy. After carrying out Elijah's revolutionary commission in Damascus by foretelling the reign of King Ben-Hadad's servant Hazael, who then murders the king Ben-Hadad, Elisha sent one of his disciples to anoint General Jehu king in place of Joram, also known as Jehoram, who was a son of Ahab. So in the process, Jehu went berserk, launching an unprecedented massacre that almost led to the extermination of the Davidic line in Jerusalem. And his actions were later condemned by the prophet Hosea. So he carried out the revolt that God told him to, but he went too far and killed a lot more people, including many people from the line of David. Prior to these events, Israelite prophets appeared as revolutionary activists. Samuel made Saul king, but then broke from him in favor of David. Prophets played a role in the division of the kingdom on both sides of the border. Elisha slaughtered the pagan prophets of Baal, and Elisha brought down dynasties. Elijah slaughtered the pagan prophets of Baal, and Elisha brought down dynasties. Later, prophets seemed to refrain from such direct revolutionary action, settling into a less violent diplomatic role, serving as advocates rather than activists. All right, we'll turn to the latter prophets. The next period from which a substantial body of prophetic material survives marks another major change in Israelite prophetic traditions. The earliest collections of substantial prophetic oracles, many of which are in poetic form, have been preserved in the scrolls of the latter prophets and originate from the mid to late 8th century BCE. This period witnessed the decline of the golden age of Jeroboam II in Israel and Uzziah in Judah, and the rise of Assyria to regional dominance. The last prophet to receive substantial attention in the former prophets, meaning the early historical books, is Isaiah, whose name also appears in one of the major scrolls of the latter prophets. Let's turn to prophetic speech and prophetic literature. So unlike many other biblical books where a pattern of organization is evident, the prophetic books seem to have no ordering to them in most cases. The most secure starting point in a literary overview of the prophetic books is the individual literary units, the prophetic sayings and narratives. Let us first examine the narratives found in prophetic books. One type of story found in several of these works is the call narrative. You see that in Isaiah chapter 6, Jeremiah 1, Ezekiel 1 through 3, and Amos chapter 7. The subject is the initial encounter of the prophet with the Lord, presumably as a form of validating the prophet's credentials as someone designated by the Lord as a messenger. The story in Isaiah 6 is an especially vivid first-person description of the Lord seated on the heavenly throne, surrounded by a company of angelic beings who proclaim his holiness. Though the prophet was overwhelmed by a feeling of unworthiness at being in the presence of the Lord, one of the angelic beings symbolically cleansed him, and the voice of the Lord commissioned him with a message for the people of Israel. Other types of narratives include reports of visions received by prophets. Probably the most famous vision narrative is Ezekiel's vision of a valley of dry bones come to life when he prophesies to them. The visions are frequently symbolic messages. Ezekiel's vision symbolizes the Lord giving hope and a new life to the house of Israel that is suffering in exile, eventually restoring them to their own land. Another form of prophetic narrative relates symbolic actions performed by the prophet as a visual statement to the people of God's will. For example, the prophet Jeremiah bought land at Anathoth near Jerusalem as a symbol of his confidence in the Lord's promise to restore Judah after the exile. Also, in the prophetic books are narratives describing dramatic encounters with kings similar to those we have seen in the former prophets. Directed by the Lord, the prophet goes to the monarch or is summoned to the court for consultation, and he delivers to the king a message either directly or through a symbol. Still, another type of prophetic narrative is the account of the persecution of the prophet by opponents who have been troubled by his announcement of judgment. The narrative sections of the prophetic books amount to only about 20% of the content. Most of the prophetic literature is poetry, ranging from very brief utterances to quite lengthy prayers, songs, and poems. For the most part, the prophetic books are collections of prophetic oracles, sayings in which the prophet announces a message of the Lord. The message that follows might be one of a variety of types. Most common is the oracle of judgment, which denounces a situation of present unfaithfulness or announces a future judgment. Other prophetic sayings are admonitions to repentance, which may include warnings of what will happen if the message is ignored, and announcements of future deliverance of the people, sometimes placed alongside an oracle of judgment. Some prophetic sayings reflect the influence of wisdom literature, including Proverbs adapted to a prophetic setting. Prophetic books also include more developed sayings. One of these is the woe oracle, which generally has three elements. First, announcement of distress. Second, reason for distress. And third, announcement of doom. Another prophetic saying is the covenant lawsuit, in which the Lord is portrayed as bringing Israel to court, accusing the nation or its leaders of violation of the stipulations of the Sinai covenant, stating the evidence and announcing the punishment. The prophet plays the role of prosecuting attorney. In addition to sayings, prophetic literature includes other poetic forms adapted from other types of literature, including harvest songs and laments and hymns common in the Psalms. Prophetic poetry, like other poetry of the Tanakh, is rich in imagery, which unfortunately loses some of its force for modern readers because of its meaning. For example, we find imagery drawn from myths that would have been familiar to ancient Israelites, but that are not familiar to modern readers, such as references to a mythic battle between the divine king, who is God, and the forces of chaos, which are often described as a sea monster or dragon. And this battle results in order and fertility. So that's a common Near Eastern myth that's adapted in some of the prophetic books. Prophetic poetry is also rich in the use of such devices as alliteration, which means the repetition of the first letter of the word, assonance, which means repetition of similar vowel sounds within a line of poetry, and also paranomasia, which means a play on words or a pun. However, recognizing these devices requires knowledge of the Hebrew language. For example, in Isaiah 5:7, when the Lord desires justice but finds bloodshed, the Hebrew words for justice and bloodshed are very similar. Good commentaries will clarify such imagery and poetic devices in Hebrew. Commentaries are books that help explain the Bible. However, much of the poetic imagery can be understood in translation. For example, the metaphors used by the prophet Amos in condemning the social injustice of his day, such as comparing the rich women to cows. Now, we might not understand all of his word plays and references. We can get the basic gist of what he's saying and making the shocking comparison of these rich women to cows. So even if we don't know Hebrew, that's the point here. Let's turn to prophetic themes: covenant, judgment, and redemption. An introduction to prophetic literature should at least attempt to sort out some of the basic themes that recur in prophetic books. Despite the risk of oversimplification, this can be a helpful framework within which to consider each particular prophet. All of the prophets assume the special relationship between the Lord and Israel expressed in the Sinai covenant. They frequently base their indictment of the people and leaders of the nations on violations of the covenant. The prophets are covenant advocates or covenant mediators who remind the nation of its responsibilities because of its special relationship with the Lord. Because the Lord has chosen Israel and entered into a covenant with this nation, the divine expectations for Israel are more rigid. On the other hand, because of this special covenantal relationship, the Lord is more reluctant to destroy the nation. Thus, the covenant creates a tension between the announcement of judgment on Israel for covenant abuse and the announcement of restoration of the nation or some part of it. The term often used to describe the Lord's basic attitude toward Israel and what the Lord expects from them as covenant partners is hesed. That's a Hebrew word which can be translated as steadfast love, mercy, compassion, faithfulness, devotion, or grace. The basic prophetic tension is heightened by the rebellion of Israel, which leads inevitably to punishment. For virtually every prophet, this rebellion is the subject, with inevitable punishment, which is often described as total punishment. However, the inevitability of punishment does not stop the prophets from calling for repentance. The prophets also look beyond the time of judgment to a period of restoration or new beginning. Sometimes the new beginning includes a picture of an age of universal peace. Okay, we'll turn to the prophetic books. Our survey of the latter prophets will examine each book in the canonical order: Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and the Scroll of the 12. And we'll start with the Isaiah Anthology. So the evidence within the book of Isaiah suggests that the material it contains cannot all have issued from a single 8th century prophet who was Isaiah of Jerusalem. At least that's the scholarly theory. There are still more conservative interpreters that disagree and think it did all come from Isaiah. But most of the scholars think that it is an anthology. So Isaiah himself mentioned a circle of disciples who would treasure his teaching in an unfavorable era. The continuity of themes through the scroll is best explained by the hypothesis that the school of disciples persisted for more than 300 years, adding their own prophetic insights from generation to generation in Jerusalem, in Babylonian exile, and again in Jerusalem. Biblical scholars conveniently refer to the principal blocks of material in the 66 chapters of Isaiah as First Isaiah, which is seen roughly as chapters 1 through 39, Second Isaiah, which is seen roughly as chapters 40 through 55, and then Third Isaiah, which is seen as roughly chapters 56 through 66. There could be some chapters from each one that fit a different block, but that's the overall way that scholars break this down into those 3 parts. Now, while no Hebrew manuscript divides Isaiah into these 3 parts, the division is based on a theory that will stand as long as no better theory is developed to explain the data. So that seems to be the best interpretation, unless somebody thinks something better. We'll start now with First Isaiah. The earliest datable material in the book of Isaiah is the temple vision of chapter 6, which supplies the date of the year of Uzziah's death, which was 742 BCE. The vision emphasizes the holiness of the Lord, which became a characteristic of the school of Isaiah. The decree Isaiah was to carry as ambassador of the divine court was one of condemnation, but the Lord would not strike without warning. Most of the first 5 chapters of Isaiah belong to the next few years before the human agency of doom was obvious, meaning Babylon or even Assyria. And Isaiah probably seemed odd for proclaiming a doom that never seemed to materialize. Like other great prophets, Isaiah insisted that justice, righteousness, and compassion, especially toward the poor and weak, were essential aspects of communal life, and obedience to the Torah was inseparable from religious faithfulness to the Lord. Crisis arose about 735 BCE when the new king Ahaz on the throne of Judah and the Assyrian Empire expanding. So when Ahaz declined to join a coalition with Israel and Syria against Assyria, which led him to face hostility with Israel and Syria for his refusal, Isaiah offered hope based on trust in the Lord. In 735, Isaiah's son, Shear-Jashub, this is a name with the symbolic meaning, a remnant shall return. So the son accompanied Isaiah on a royal interview. Ahaz had already sent messengers to the Assyrian king, begging aid. Judah became Assyria's voluntary vassal, and Ahaz dutifully introduced Assyrian religious objects into the temple of the Lord in Jerusalem. So obviously that, again, was that proved his unfaithfulness to the Lord to Yahweh, the God of Israel, by worshiping these gods from another nation. All right. Isaiah withdrew from public life after Ahaz's treachery, but returned about 715 BC to advise a new king, Hezekiah, in a new crisis. Isaiah warned against the widespread rebellion against Assyria, and Hezekiah listened. Historical materials are presented in chapter 36, I think it's 36 through 39, which most likely are not in chronological order, as the embassy of the Babylonian king to Hezekiah certainly precedes the war with Assyria. Hezekiah joined a rebellion stimulated in part by the Babylonians. The Assyrian king Sennacherib dealt with the rebels in a series of ruthless campaigns. In 701, every fortified city of Judah was destroyed and Jerusalem seemed doomed. Isaiah advised Hezekiah to trust in the Lord, and the Assyrian army unexpectedly withdrew, which was attributed to the power of the Lord. The Bible describes a large number of the army dying, whether that's from a plague or exactly what happened, we're not really sure. We don't have the historical evidence, but it's attributed to God's power to save Judah because they were on the way to, or they were sieging Jerusalem. All right. The remaining materials of Isaiah, chapters 28 through 33, probably issue from the years surrounding the crisis of 701, and they emphasize the themes of faithfulness and trust in the Lord, and scorn for all false sources of confidence. We'll turn now to 2nd Isaiah. Again, this is not a different book in the Bible. This is just based on the theory of scholars that there were 3 different parts of Isaiah. So the historical notes in Isaiah 40 through 55 seem to set this material off from the earlier chapters. Jerusalem is in ruins, and the Judeans are suffering at Babylonian hands. But Babylon itself is on the verge of doom. Cyrus of Persia is named as the deliverer, and he's even called, the term Messiah is even used, or the Lord's anointed, to describe Cyrus. Obviously, nobody believes he is the Messiah in the sense Christians believe that about Jesus, but he was seen as God's agent at the time to save and deliver Judah and send them back to their homeland. So this evidence suggests that 2nd Isaiah speaks near the end of the Babylonian exile, about the years 539 to 538 BCE. The historical evidence accords with the literary data. The style of this material is distinctive, with long and complex poems, unlike the short prophetic sayings typical of earlier chapters. The theme of hope and redemption has replaced the mood of doom. However, 2nd Isaiah bears many similarities with 1st Isaiah, such as continuing the theme of the holiness of the Lord. 2nd Isaiah develops the theme of holiness into a theoretical assertion of monotheism. In other words, for 2nd Isaiah, the Lord is the only deity, and the gods of all peoples, or the Lord is ultimately the God of all peoples, and Israel will carry the truth of the Lord to all peoples. So idolatry throughout the nations is condemned or denounced and even made fun of, we would say, or mocked, because the prophet came to believe that the Lord, Yahweh, was the only true God, and everything else was just an image of wood or stone made by human hands. So the mission of Israel is portrayed in a series of servant songs in which the nation is personified in the figure of a servant who vicariously bears in his suffering the sins of the nations. And that's later interpreted by Christians to refer specifically to Jesus, but in its context, the prophet probably intended the nation of Israel as a whole. Okay, third Isaiah, chapters 56 through 66 of Isaiah do not exhibit the same consistencies of theme and style as first or second Isaiah. Rather, it is unified by a common historical setting, the situation of Jerusalem after some of the exiles have returned. Third Isaiah is probably a collection of prophecies of the Isaiah school produced after about 515 BCE. Okay, next we have oracles against foreign nations. Number 4, archaeologists have unearthed numerous texts from ancient Near Eastern cult sites in which curses are leveled against foreign enemies. So thus it is not surprising that Israelite prophets sometimes proclaimed the wrath of the Lord on Israel's foes, as seen in the oracles that take place in Isaiah 13 through 23. So whether or not you remove this material from the section of first Isaiah, see this a separate section, or whether this is part of what the first Isaiah prophesied, there can be different debates among scholars on that. But for our purposes, we'll see it as something different. So of particular interest is a song in Isaiah 14, taunting a dead Babylonian king, described as a fallen god or angel. The song gives us a graphic description of the underworld where the dead dwell. Now, traditionally, Christians have interpreted this to be about the fall of Satan, and if they see the name Lucifer in some versions of the Bible, I think that was the name of Satan as an angel before he fell from heaven. In context, the song is not about Satan, but that's the interpretation that Christians traditionally had given this, based on this kind of mythological language of falling from heaven. But it is more literally in its context about the fall of the Babylonian king. And then we have the number 5, the Isaiah Apocalypse. Isaiah 24 through 27 seems more in tune with apocalyptic than prophetic literature. It's sometimes called proto-apocalyptic, meaning like the first type of prophetic literature, or a transitional form between prophetic and apocalyptic writing. We'll get to apocalyptic a little later in the chapter or in the lesson. But themes that we see in this section include resurrection, or people being raised from the dead, universal judgment, a cosmic battle between the Lord and mythic foes, and a banquet heralding a new age of peace. Now we turn to the book of Jeremiah. The book of Jeremiah transmits more information about the prophet at the head of his tradition than any other prophetic book. In other words, we have more personal information about Jeremiah in this book than we do about prophets in the other books. So there are descriptive data about the activities of the prophet and subjective information about the prophet himself. With the note that Jeremiah's secretary Baruch wrote down a collection of Jeremiah's oracles, we have evidence about the development of prophetic books. Jeremiah's activities spanned the most calamitous decades of Judean history prior to the Christian era. The years from 620 to 609 BCE had been years of nationalism, reform, expansion, and prosperity under Josiah. But from Josiah's death in 609, disaster piled upon disaster, culminating in the destruction of Jerusalem and its temple by the Babylonian army in the years 587 to 586 BCE. Scholars have long debated the role Jeremiah may have played in the reform. The earliest datable oracle in Jeremiah, which is chapter 22, issued from 609, the year of Josiah's death and the effective end of the reform of Josiah. So unlike Isaiah, Jeremiah was an unwilling prophet. Isaiah agreed right away to his call, but Jeremiah protested. So at the time of his call, he protested due to his youth. Later in his career, he tried to quit prophesying, but failed. He felt compelled by the hand of God upon him, or the word of God burning inside of him. So his reluctance was understandable, for his prophetic activity made him unpopular. And he even became the target of an assassination plot. He was beaten and imprisoned through much of the Babylonian siege. He was put into a cistern where he sank in the mud that almost killed him, but he was let out before he died. All right. So the early oracles of Jeremiah spoke of doom and subjected him to mockery when the catastrophe was slow to materialize. From a secular viewpoint, Jeremiah seemed to be the pawn of the pro-Babylonian party at the court that was opposing the pro-Egyptian party. So we had some people in the Jewish court supporting the Babylonians, some supporting the Egyptians, and it seemed like Jeremiah was supporting the Babylonians. From a prophetic viewpoint, the Lord had commissioned him to announce that Babylonian domination was divine judgment on the sins of the nation and its rulers. The confessions of Jeremiah are unique in prophetic literature. These utterances not only mourn the prophet's fate, but also challenge the Lord, accusing God of deception and unfair use of the deity's great power, overwhelming Jeremiah, essentially, before swinging to the realization that the Lord is the prophet's only source of hope. The Lord promises that if Jeremiah is steadfast, God will not allow him to be totally overwhelmed. When the doom of which Jeremiah had spoken arrived, Jeremiah turned from the time of judgment, or the theme of judgment, to envision hope for Israel. He wrote to the exiles of the 597 deportation, warning them against superficial hopes of an early restoration, but with the promise that the Lord would ultimately restore Jerusalem. So God was going to restore them, just not as quickly as they hoped or wanted. And while he was imprisoned during the Babylonian siege, he took the seemingly illogical step of buying property in his hometown of Anathoth, redeeming family property in expectation that God would redeem Judah. His passage about the new covenant in chapter 31 promises a renewal of the Lord's relationship with Israel and Judah based on a covenant written on the heart of the people. Jeremiah survived the fall of Jerusalem. He declined a Babylonian position in order to share the lot of his people in a ravaged Judah, joining the court of the appointed governor, Gedaliah. But when Gedaliah was murdered, a group of fearful refugees forced him to go with them to Egypt, where he continues his courageous prophetic work. So a note of concern for individual responsibility also appeared in his oracles. People will reap the consequences of their own behavior and cannot blame everything on the sins of their fathers. So if the Jewish people felt like they were suffering punishment because of the sins of their ancestors, Jeremiah emphasized it's for your own sins that you're suffering. Okay, now we turn to Ezekiel. The autobiographical introduction to the book of Ezekiel presents him as a priest among the exiles of the first Babylonian deportation in 597 BCE. His prophetic activity dates from the 5th year of Jehoiakim's exile in 592 BCE. So his datable oracles extend to the late 570s. Jewish rabbis of the 1st century CE debated whether Ezekiel was canonical for two reasons. First, they were troubled by the mystical speculation that stemmed from Ezekiel's vision of the chariot of the Lord and felt the use of Ezekiel should be restricted. Second, Ezekiel's envisioned plan for the reconstruction of the temple, chapters 40 through 48, differed from the rules for the tabernacle temple in Leviticus. Ezekiel's own reported trance states have been a source of controversy among modern students. However, the phenomena he reported are well documented in anthropological literature. And we'll describe some of those coming up. The book of Ezekiel locates the prophet's primary activity among the exiles in Babylon, but he claimed access to Jerusalem by vision and levitation. So God showed him visions of Jerusalem. God transported him miraculously or supernaturally to Jerusalem, and he seemed well informed about the situation there. The contents of the book are topically arranged into 4 blocks. Chapters 1 through 24 are mostly oracles denouncing the sins of Israel and Judah. Chapters 25 through 32 contain oracles against foreign nations, and chapters 33 through 39 are mainly oracles of hope. Chapters 40 through 48 contain an idealized plan for the reconstruction of the temple and the national life of Israel. Ezekiel exhibits more colorful symbolic actions than any other prophet. He eats a scroll and lies first on one side and then another for long periods. He dramatized the fate of the King Zedekiah. So these actions are graphic prophetic messages. The career of Ezekiel, like that of Jeremiah, may have reached a turning point with the fall of Jerusalem. When judgment struck, the prophet of doom became the prophet of hope. His most famous prophecy of renewal is that of the dry bones coming together and returning to life, symbolic of the restoration of the nation. Ezekiel denounced those he considered false prophets, saying they presented a faulty defensive wall. He stands in the classical prophetic tradition with his condemnation of ethical transgressions, violence, corruption, and bloodshed, but he saw idolatry and religious infidelity as the most serious sins. The term Son of Man is God's favorite title for the prophet Ezekiel. This is a term which, in this context, clearly means a human being or a man, though the term developed added meaning in later biblical writings. And of course, we know in the New Testament that Jesus uses that term for himself as sort of a possibly a veiled identification to be the Messiah. We'll get to that the next week or two. Ezekiel further envisions a life-giving stream that issues from the restored temple. This is an image with roots in Genesis 2 and a likely source of inspiration for the similar image in Revelation 22 at the end of the Bible. Okay, those are the scrolls of the 3 major prophets. We'll turn now to the scroll of the 12. So this section of the canon is known to modern Christians as the books of the minor prophets, though they should be considered minor only in length. In other words, they're still important. They're a lot shorter than the major prophets, but that does not mean they're less important. All 12 together roughly equal the length of one of the 3 major prophets, so thus bringing the latter prophets up to 4 scrolls and balancing the 4 scrolls of the former prophets, which include Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings. So there is no clearly there's no clearly discernible reason underlying the arrangement of materials within the scroll of the 12, and the 12 sections are not in chronological sequence. So we don't know why they're ordered quite the way they are. First, we have Hosea. The evidence within the book of Hosea suggests that this prophet witnessed the disintegration of the era of prosperity in the northern kingdom under Jeroboam II and in the south under Uzziah, as well as the Syro-Ephraimite war that followed. So most likely this dates Hosea's career to the years 745 to 725 BCE. Hosea vigorously denounced oppression and exploitation of the poor, especially by the perversion of the courts by the wealthy and powerful. He also shared the other prophets' abhorrence at religious apostasy, meaning unfaithfulness to God or worshiping other gods, including cultic aspects of foreign diplomatic alliances. Hosea's private life was intertwined with his prophetic message. At the Lord's instruction, he married a common prostitute named Gomer, who then left him, becoming a metaphor of the Lord's relationship with Israel. Gomer represented Israel's unfaithfulness to the Lord, who continued to love Israel and strive to win her back, just as Hosea did with Gomer. Hosea also used other metaphors for the waywardness of Israel, such as a stubborn domestic animal and a rebellious child. He emphasizes the Lord's deep love for his people. Again, that word used is hesed. Though he thought of the sufferings of war and exile as the path to repentance and ultimately God's saving purpose for the nation. Next, we have Joel. Internal evidence for the book of Joel suggests a post-exilic date, which is 5th or 4th century BCE for Joel's prophecy. The sacrificial practices seem to reflect the priestly code, and the dispersion of Jews seems to be a fact of life. So it seems to have definitely take place during this time after the exile. So the most likely date for the book of Joel is 400 to 350 BCE. The prophecy begins with an account of a severe locust plague accompanied by droughts. The prophet realizes that this disaster may foretell a cosmic catastrophe, the dreaded day of the Lord. The Lord commands a fast with genuine repentance, and the lament of the people is answered by the assurance that Israel's enemies will suffer while the Israelite exiles will return home to become secure and prosperous. Joel provides a life setting comparable to the laments common in the Psalms, as well as a prophecy of the coming of the Holy Spirit, quoted by Peter in his Pentecost sermon in the book of Acts. Next, we have Amos. The book of Amos contains the earliest collection of oracles in the scroll of the 12. Amos lived in the time of Jeroboam II, and Uzziah can be placed at about 750 BCE. So the book describes the word of the Lord is coming to the prophets. Some of Amos's visions are narrated: a locust plague, a severe drought, and a wall hopelessly out of alignment. And this symbolizes the inevitable doom of Israel. His visions may reflect the perception of profound significance in ordinary sights rather than mystical experiences. In other words, these may not have been visions, but These may have just been common things that he saw in his daily life that had a deeper meaning that God gave to him. Amos's first set of oracles reflects the rhetorical skill of the prophet or compiler, using a formula of wisdom, teaching that begins with 3 items and then adds a 4th. Amos also plays upon the prejudices of his Israelite audience by denouncing the surrounding nations, culminating in an oracle against his Judean homeland, the southern kingdom, and then moving to a detailed condemnation of the Torah violations of Israel, the northern kingdom, to whom he speaks. In his condemnation of foreign nations, Amos appealed to a sense of common morality. In his denunciation of Israel and Judah, he held them accountable for the Mosaic covenant. He criticized the religious hypocrisy that substituted ritual for ethical behavior, worshiping God formally while exploiting the poor and perverting justice. Amos was not a professional prophet, but was minding his own business when God sent him north to denounce uncovenant faithfulness. So he came from the southern kingdom to the northern kingdom. He also did not seem to have hope for his audience, and the prophecy of restoration in chapter 9 may be a later addition. Next is Obadiah. The book of Obadiah is only 1 chapter long, and it belongs to the oracles against foreign nations, to that kind of category of prophetic sayings. Obadiah directs his prophecy against Edom, the descendants of Esau, thus related to the Israelites. Edom took advantage of Judah's fall after 587 to loot, pillage, and take territory in the Negev area. So thus, Edom became the object of God's wrath reflected by Obadiah. A date during the exile or early post-exilic period is generally accepted for this book. Next is Jonah. Now, while there was a prophet named Jonah in the 8th century BCE, the book of Jonah is unlike any other tradition in the latter prophets. It is not a collection of oracles mixed with narrative interludes, but a narrative with only one oracle. So it reads more like a short story. The tale is full of satire and irony, and the prophet is portrayed as absurd and self-righteous. Everything he does is inappropriate, and his only correct action occurs under duress. Jonah is the model of hypocritical persons who would reserve God's love for themselves and their own people while condemning their enemies to God's wrath. A precise date for this work is nearly impossible to defend, but a post-exilic date seems likely. Next is the book of Micah. Micah is the only canonical prophet quoted by name in another section of the latter prophets, namely in the book of Jeremiah. His career fits between the Assyrian campaign against Samaria in the mid-720s and Sennacherib's siege of Jerusalem in 701 BCE. Micah denounced the exploitation of the rural poor and saw the cities as full of evil. The most famous passage in Micah takes the form of a covenant lawsuit with a conclusion summarizing 8th century prophetic themes of what the Lord requires of people: do justice, love mercy, and walk humbly with God. Next is the book of Nahum. Nothing is known of the prophet Nahum. Even the usual association with a king is missing in the book. Nahum's prophecy is concerned solely with the fall of Nineveh, the Assyrian capital, to the Medo-Babylonian coalition in 612 BCE. His words have the characteristic of a taunt song rather than an oracle against a foreign nation. And next is Habakkuk. The setting for this work is suggested by the references to the Chaldeans, the aristocracy of the Neo-Babylonian Empire. The date for the book seems to be between 605 BCE and 600 BCE, with the Babylonian armies active, but Jerusalem not yet fallen. Habakkuk dared to question the Lord about the moral operations of the world. Why do the wicked prosper and go unpunished? And questions like that. The Lord responded that he was raising up the wrath of the Chaldeans to punish Judean sinners. Habakkuk then protested that this cure was worse than the disease, to which the Lord contrasted the wrong spirit of the proud with the faithfulness of the righteous. There's the famous verse, "The righteous will live by faith," that's quoted in the New Testament, and was also important to Martin Luther, who helped begin led to the Protestant Reformation. Now, in the context, the word faith probably means something more like faithfulness or fidelity, rather than just faith or belief in God. All right, so the final chapter is a lament with indications of use in worship, offering another response to Habakkuk's question that the Lord is the master of all chaotic powers. So, of course, that would include the Babylonian armies. Next, we have Zephaniah. The heading of this book locates the prophet in the reign of Josiah, who reigned from 640 to 609 BCE. He stands in the classical prophetic tradition, denouncing religious apostasy, social syncretism, so kind of mixing with the nations in terms of both religion and political or social system, rather than being true to the Israelite religion and social system. Also religious indifference, violence and oppression, official corruption, and pride and lying. He also gives the most vivid account of the approaching day of the Lord, in which everything on the face of the earth will be swept away. Despite this radical language, there is still an element of hope, as a few of the humble and lowly will be spared. So, right, the 10th book is Haggai. Ezra reports that Haggai prophesied at the time that the governor Zerubbabel and high priest Joshua began to reconstruct the Jerusalem temple. His work is dated to the year 520 BCE. Haggai's prophecies offered strong support for the temple program. He promises that the restored house would exceed the glory of its predecessor, despite current appearances of much less grandeur, or that the temple so far looks much less grand or splendid. So the practicality of Haggai balances the idealism noted in some of the other prophets. It is more down to earth, more concerned with things in this world, and specifically with building the temple in that situation. Next, we have Zechariah, number 11. Zechariah was a contemporary of Haggai who shared his zeal for a rebuilt temple and a purified community, while holding out hope of divine intervention to create an ideal age. Chapters 1 through 8 report a series of night visions, followed by a description of the crowning of Joshua as a messianic leader. Not to say he is the Messiah, but just God's hand is upon him to be an important leader in that time. So chapters 7 through 8 offer classical prophetic oracles. Chapters 9 through 14 seem to be later in occurrence. Chapters 9 through 11 announce the restoration of Israel, with the Messianic king entering Jerusalem on a colt. Chapters 12 through 14 announce the coming day of the Lord, when Jerusalem will be purified, the covenant will be renewed, and there will be a universal kingdom centered in Jerusalem. All right, and finally, number 12, the last minor prophet, last book of the minor prophets, is Malachi. The name Malachi may actually be a title that means my messenger. Reflections of religious customs in the book suggest a time earlier than Ezra. However, the fervor stirred by the temple rebuilders had weakened, and Malachi attacks religious indifference. Chapters 3 through 4 also refer to a coming messenger who will prepare the way for the Lord. And this messenger is named as Elijah. And this is an oracle that has deeply influenced Jewish and Christian theology. Jews believe Elijah will return before the day of the Lord or before the Messiah. And during some of their celebrations, they actually set a place at the table for Elijah. And Christians believe that John the Baptist was a kind of Elijah, not exactly Elijah, but the person that fulfills that role and being the forerunner of the Messiah, Jesus. John the Baptist sort of began that type of ministry that Jesus continued. So near the end of the book, Malachi calls the people to remember the teaching of Moses. That's a call to Torah faithfulness, which resonates with all the prophets of Israel. Okay, and we will turn to the writings section of the Old Testament or Tanakh, and we don't have that much time, so I'm going to have to abbreviate chapters 7, 8, and 9 just to go through briefly the books in this writing section. So we'll start with chapter 7, Israel's sacred songs. That includes the books of Psalms, Song of Songs, and Lamentations. So this is part 1 of the writings section. The third section of the Hebrew canon is the writings. The Hebrew word is Keturim. It was the final section of the Tanakh to be incorporated in the canon. Inclusion of some of the books, especially Esther, the Song of Songs, and Ecclesiastes, was the subject of serious discussion and debates within the Jewish community. Several types of literature are found in the writings: songs, wisdom literature, short stories, historical narratives, and apocalyptic literature. The Book of Psalms, the Song of Songs, and Lamentations represent different types of songs in ancient Israel. The Psalms is a collection of various types of poems, most of which were sung in the context of worship. The Song of Songs is an anthology of love poetry from ancient Israel, and Lamentations is a group of poems of anguish that were all motivated by the destruction of Jerusalem in 587 BCE. The Book of Psalms is a collection of 150 poems. Most of these were addressed to God. They are the substance of worship and Jewish and Christian practices, or they are the substance of worship and Jewish and Christian practices to this day, and a source of private devotion and reflection for millions of people. So thus, this book may be the most influential single book of the Bible. We can assume that most psalms originated as songs associated with corporate worship. So in that sense, they were the product of the life of the community as much as the work of individual poets. However, some psalms may have originated as religious poems by individuals apart from a liturgical or worship type setting. It is likely that psalms were composed throughout the biblical period, certainly from the time of David and Solomon onward. And there's even one psalm that's attributed to Moses. The present collection comes from the post-exilic period, although individual psalms may have been composed much earlier. The Song of Songs, also known as the Song of Solomon or Canticles, is a collection of erotic love poetry that frankly celebrates physical passion, which leads often to a sense of shock when people read this book, a shock that it is in the Bible. So it's not surprising that many have interpreted the poems allegorically since rabbinic times. For Jewish interpreters, the song was taken as an allegory of the Lord's relationship with his bride Israel. Christian interpreters saw in the imagery a symbol of Christ's love for the church. In these poems, male and female speakers voice freely their affection and desire for one another in passionate expressions of love. As a whole, the poems are a celebration of the love of a man, or the love a man feels for a woman, and the love a woman feels for a man. The song echoes the view of sexuality that Genesis presents as the way God intended it to be before the rebellion of man and woman led to the embarrassment and manipulation that still afflict the expression of physical love today. The Book of Lamentations is a collection of 5 poems mourning the destruction of the city of Jerusalem. Originally composed after Jerusalem was sacked and the temple destroyed by the Babylonians in 587 BCE, the poems became part of the yearly remembrance of this terrible event in the Jewish liturgical calendar. Although tradition assigns it to Jeremiah, it was probably an anthology of poems by several poets, not all from one person. Let's turn now to chapter 8, the way of wisdom, which is about the books of Proverbs, Job, and Ecclesiastes. We'll call this part 2 of the writings. Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and Job are the Tanakh's examples of a type of literature common in the ancient Near East and even throughout history and throughout different cultures, wisdom literature. Even cultures like in China, you have wisdom literature by teachers like Confucius and Lao Tzu. So these are similar in some way. Now, these writings are distinct from the rest of the Tanakh, except for isolated examples in their style and their views of the world. Stylistically, these works are dominated by short observations and instructions about life and how to live. You see that especially in Proverbs and Ecclesiastes. You also see poetic dialogue in the book of Job, and you see poems focusing on the nature and meaning of life, also in the book of Ecclesiastes and Job. So in these books, themes such as Torah and the covenant that recur in the rest of the Tanakh are missing. The concern is not the Lord's involvement in history with Israel and other nations, and the hope of fulfillment of God's promises. Instead, the wisdom writings treat the human search for and maintenance of order. This is a practical search for happiness through living with decency and dignity in accord with the natural and social order. The search also includes a deeper and more speculative level, reflecting the quest for an underlying order in the world and answers to questions such as, why do the innocent suffer? Is there justice in the world? If we all die, what is the meaning of life? These works stand apart from the major storyline of the Bible as a set of writings whose concerns are always contemporary, meaning they're relevant to life in all ages and all time periods. The wisdom books are unique in the Hebrew scriptures, but they stand within a literary and intellectual tradition pervasive through history. Every culture produces proverbs that gain authority through usage, and literary works that reflect on basic human questions. Wisdom works are also found in the Deuterocanon and the New Testament, in addition to ancient Egyptian and Mesopotamian writings. All right, so the Book of Proverbs is divided into a series of collections of short sentences and instructions, with a few longer poems intermixed. The short sayings are usually in poetic form as well. As a whole, the book is an anthology of sayings and poems. It presents wisdom in practical terms, contrasting the rewards of wise living with the perils of foolish behavior. It assumes that God generally rewards goodness and punishes evil. The book also speculates on the source of authority of wisdom, claiming that wisdom is the life-giving principle apparent in the very process of creation. The legend about Job is a tale about a righteous, blameless man tested by God at the urging of the Satan or adversary, who is the accuser or the member of the divine court who was charged with earthly intelligence work. When the Lord expressed pride in Job, Satan protests that God has given him everything, and he challenges the Lord to take away everything to test his faithfulness. The Lord agrees to the wager to take away his protection, first taking away his possessions and killing his children, and then afflicting him with a skin disease. So this establishes the basic themes of the story. Is there disinterested righteousness, or do people honor God only because it pays? Job refuses to curse God, which was Satan's test. Or Satan said that Job would curse God under these circumstances. Job refused to curse God. He's willing to accept both good and evil from the Lord, at least in the first two chapters, the narrative sections. So three friends come to comfort Job, and initially they sit in silence with him. Then the poetic section begins. In poetic dialogue, Job laments his birth. He's suffering so much he wishes he'd never been born. His three friends then take turns accusing him of committing some sin, and they do this assuming that this must be the reason for his suffering. He wouldn't be suffering this much unless he had done something to deserve it. While Job protests his innocence. And that happens throughout most of the prophetic, or through most of the poetic dialogue. Now it takes an appearance of God near the end of the dialogue for Job to learn the lesson that he must revere God even though he does not understand why he is suffering. In the final analysis, the book of Job dramatizes two quite different roads to the basic truth that faith in God cannot be a conditioned response to the expectation of reward or the fear of punishment. So you must honor and serve God despite expectations of gaining rewards or whether or not you fear any punishment. God must be served for his own sake. That's the point of the story. Now, like the book of Job, Ecclesiastes reflects a search for meaning amid a world in which evil flourishes and good goes unrewarded. However, instead of a poetic dialogue surrounded by a story, Ecclesiastes is an anthology of the reflections of an old sage, meaning a wise teacher. It is detached and philosophical, looking back over life and sharing the findings of someone who has seen it all. In Ecclesiastes, we feel the futility of wisdom. The theme of Ecclesiastes is that there is no great meaning or purpose to life. The truth is that we live for a while, die, and are forgotten. Whatever humans do to try to accomplish or discover meaning leads only to frustration. God is in control of life, but God's purpose is beyond human understanding, despite our deep yearning to know it. The best we can hope for is enjoyment of the daily routine of life shared with others. This is the gift of God to humankind. An endnote, which was likely added later, gives the advice to honor God and keep his commands. Now we'll turn to chapter 9, the rest of the writings, which includes the books of Chronicles, Ezra, Nehemiah, Ruth, Esther, and Daniel. The remaining books of the third section of the Hebrew canon, the writings, represent three different types of literature. Historical narrative that we see in Chronicles, Ezra, and Nehemiah, a short story that we see in Ruth and Esther, and apocalypse that we see in Daniel. The historical narrative is another version of events from the time of Saul through the period of the Babylonian exile, with a genealogical introduction that links the story to the beginning of time. We see that in Chronicles, and a narrative concerning life after the return from the exile in 538 BCE. We see that in Ezra and Nehemiah. Ruth and Esther present us with an opportunity to examine two Hebrew short stories, both of which focus on a courageous woman. Daniel introduces us to apocalyptic literature and invites historical reflection on apocalyptic movements and apocalyptic thought. In the Tanakh, the books of Ezra and Nehemiah are considered one work. Ezra begins precisely where Chronicles ends, with a note about the decree of Cyrus, the king of Persia, that allowed the restoration to Jerusalem and the rebuilding of the temple. Considered together, Chronicles and Ezra and Nehemiah tell a story that begins with the establishment of the Jewish province of Judea under priestly leadership. The books together are known as the Chronicler's History, and many scholars think they are the work of a single author, possibly Ezra, or that's at least a traditional view. The Chronicler's History portrays the rise and fall of the nation Israel and its limited resurgence after the exile, beginning with creation, but skipping quickly to David. The books of Chronicles show how the nation prospered when there were rulers who were concerned with the proper worship of the Lord in the temple in Jerusalem, who supported the priesthood and lived virtuously. When this high level of devotion to the Lord faltered, the nation weakened until disaster struck and the temple was destroyed. Ezra Nehemiah portrays the restoration of the people to their land and also the level of devotion to the Lord, reminiscent of the time of David. Against considerable opposition, the temple was rebuilt, the priesthood was allowed to function again, and devotion to the Torah was renewed. With new leadership, there was new hope for Israel. In the Hebrew canon, the Book of Ruth is one of the festival scrolls known as the Megillah, which was read annually at Pentecost, also known as Shabbat or the Feast of Weeks. In the Christian canon, it appears in its presumed chronological setting after the Book of Judges. The first verse and the last verse give the book a historical context set during the period of the Judges. it is the story of the foreign woman who was the great grandmother of King David. Ruth is a story of the struggle and triumph of two women in a male dominated society. On two levels, Ruth is a story of redemption. On the one hand, it is the story of how two courageous women succeeded in winning the legal right of redemption, which involved the custom of Levirate marriage, in which the nearest male relative of a man who died without sons had the responsibility to marry the widow and sire a son who would be the legal son of the deceased kinsman. At another level, another kind of redemption takes place as the selfless love of Ruth redeems a broken and bitter Naomi. Naomi is Ruth's mother-in-law, who is depressed by the death of her husband and sons, she had two sons who both died with no heirs. And it's Ruth's love that ultimately restores her, or Ruth's loyalty and commitment to her. The story is structured in 4 scenes. In the first scene, the central dilemma is identified. In the second and third, the tension increases as solutions are sought. In the final scene, resolution occurs as Ruth marries the kinsman redeemer Boaz and gives birth to a son. And then we see the notes at the end of the story saying that this son eventually is leads to the lineage of King David. Now, there are a number of similarities between the books of Ruth and Esther. Besides being among the festival scrolls of the Hebrew canon, both are found among the historical books in the Christian canon. So Esther is after Ezra and Nehemiah. Both stories are about courageous women whose actions have far-reaching consequences for their people, and both are set rather loosely in historical contexts. Esther is set in the Persian period. In the book of Esther, God is not even mentioned, and it's not surprising that the canonical status of Esther was debated among both Jews and Christians. Esther is a tale full of intrigue, violence, and dramatic action in which a Jewish girl named Esther replaces the Persian queen and has to approach the king, risking her life to do so because it's risks the death penalty to appear before the king unless you're summoned in this context, even for the queen. And she does this to stop a plot by the king's official, Haman is the name, the official, to exterminate the Jewish people. There are several major themes of the book: the gaining of power by Jews in a situation of powerlessness, the importance of loyalty to the Jewish community over fidelity to unjust civil powers, and the underlying pattern beyond the level of human intrigue. Throughout the story, reversal and irony are used to develop these themes. So we see things like the Jewish official, or the Persian official Haman, who wants to destroy the Jews, ends up being destroyed himself in the same way. And the enemies of the Jews end up being destroyed as the Jews are empowered to fight back against them, things like that. So even though God is never mentioned, the story can still be pointing toward the divine patterning of events with the release and fulfillment for the people of God. Though interpreters disagree over whether the events described in the story actually took place, the story serves as an explanation for the Feast of Purim, which was adapted for use in the Jewish community. All right, and now we turn to the final writing, Book of Daniel. In the Book of Daniel, we encounter a new type of literature, apocalyptic, meaning revealing. Apocalypses are unveilings of things to come, revelations of the pattern of events that will lead to the end of the present historical age and the beginning of a new age. Because of the use of highly symbolic language, apocalyptic language is both difficult to understand and susceptible to misinterpretation. Although Daniel is the only apocalyptic book in the Tanakh, there are apocalyptic-like sections in some of the other prophetic books, or some of the prophetic books we talked about. Apocalyptic literature reports visions from God concerning events that will climax in the vanquishing of the forces of evil and the establishment of a new age of righteousness. There are a number of paired opposites in apocalyptic literature between this age and the next, between the forces of good and evil, and between heaven and earth. The visions are of the heavenly events that will determine the course of history at the earthly level. They are full of highly symbolic, mythic imagery of angels, gods, and dragons, and other animals, representing the forces of chaos. Apocalyptic writings often speak of life beyond death, ensuring that the righteous who die before the end of the present age will not be denied their place in the kingdom, and that the wicked will receive their just punishment. There is also mention of the agent or agents who will rule in the new age for God, sometimes harmonizing this figure with the messianic expectations of a new King David who will restore the fortunes of Israel. Apocalyptic movements and literature developed in Judaism and are at times of persecution and crisis, finding hope in the alternative symbolic universe of the visions they believed predicted an imminent deliverance and new age. Although placed among the prophets in the Greek canon, which is the order adopted by the Christian churches, the book of Daniel's placement among the writings in the Hebrew canon indicates that it was recognized as a different type of literature and completed after the prophetic canon was closed. The book has two easily distinguished sections. The first 6 chapters form a collection of legends about Daniel and his 3 friends who are presented as deportees to Babylon after a Babylonian siege of Jerusalem. Daniel demonstrates his allegiance to God when tested and rises to influence in a foreign court because of his skill as an interpreter of dreams. We see some similarities between Daniel and Joseph in that regard. The second half of Daniel, which is chapters 7 through 12, is a collection of 4 apocalyptic visions with interpretations by angels received and written down by Daniel. The visions are graphic symbols of the unfolding of history from the time of Daniel to the end, when an everlasting kingdom will be established. In the final chapter, Daniel is assured by the angel Gabriel that when the present age draws to a close, Israel's guardian angel Michael will arise, and the righteous will be victorious. The dead will be raised, some to everlasting life, and others to everlasting contempt. But for now, Daniel is to seal the visions until the time of the end. Daniel's detailed visions point towards the desecration of the temple by the Seleucid ruler Antiochus Epiphanes in the year 176 BCE, which led to the revolt of the Maccabees, or the Maccabean revolt. Evidence leads to the conclusion that chapters 7 through 12 emerged in the year 164 BCE to encourage the group known as the Hasidim, or the faithful ones, who practiced passive resistance when Hellenistic practices were forced on the Jews and Jewish practices were outlawed. So they didn't directly fight like the Maccabees did in revolt, but they did passively resist and even were willing to die for their faith or their practices. Modern historians believe the Hasidim were the apocalyptic community for which Daniel was written. Okay, so this concludes our section of the Old Testament, the Tanakh. For the primary text, I've given you Isaiah 6, which is about Isaiah's commission or Isaiah's call, the vision where he sees God and God calls him to be a prophet. You can read that or look up all these texts on Bible Gateway if you don't have a Bible yourself. BibleGateway.com. It's a website that's got the Bible. Okay, now for your assignment, it should be assignment 5, which is necessary for your attendance credits. I'm asking the same questions. Did you watch the lecture video, and what is a main idea you took from this week's lecture? And for extra credits, if you want to do the extra credits and get a few more bonus points, read Isaiah 6 and answer the following questions. Summarize the story of Isaiah's call in your own words. Do you think such direct encounters still occur today? Are people still called to particular careers or for special missions? And give reasons for your answer. Don't just say yes or no, but give some reasons, maybe something you've experienced or yourself or heard about. Now, hopefully you can apply this whether or not you, or whatever your religious backgrounds, even if you're not Christian or if you don't even believe in a God, just your sense of fate or destiny. Are people called to, are destined for certain things in their life, to do certain things? So that is the extra credit question for today. I am working on grading your midterm test. I've caught up on all your other assignments. Get back to you with any other assignments you turn in. Hopefully you're all doing well. Wish you all the best. Have a great week and take care.